This is the Ethanol Report, the industry podcast from the Renewable Fuels Association since 2008. I'm Cindy Zimmerman. Major announcements out of the Trump administration last week were welcome news for the ethanol industry, while at the same time, not quite all that's needed. I am speaking to Renewable Fuels Association President and CEO Geoff Cooper about the latest announcements. And well, let's start with E15 because that one came first. The Trump administration made the announcement that they would be allowing sales through waivers through the summer. So this got a lot of national coverage, and people don't always get all the information because they have to kind of shorten it down when you do it in the media. But so tell us about what this means. Basically, it's the same thing that we've done for the last several years, but a lot of people don't understand this very complicated issue. So go ahead and tell us what the announcement means.
Well, it was good news, first of all, that the administration announced earlier than usual that it's going to be giving emergency waivers to allow the continued sale of E15 through the summer months. And you're right, Cindy, a lot of folks in the mainstream media that aren't paying close attention think that this is somehow a new thing, that E15 is going to be a new fuel this summer. That's not what this is. This is simply EPA using its authority to allow the continued sale of E15 through the summer months and allowing that product to be offered year round. And their reasons for doing that are obvious. We have near record high prices at the pump today because of what's happening in Iran. There's legitimate concern about potential fuel shortages this summer. And so EPA is looking at the tools in its toolbox and saying one way we can help mitigate that is to allow continued sales of higher ethanol blends, E15 specifically, that helps extend fuel supplies. And you're extending fuel supplies with a lower cost fuel. So, of course, it makes all the sense in the world for EPA to utilize its authority to do that. But it's the same thing that EPA's done the last 5 years. And while it's good news, it's a little bittersweet. We were hoping we wouldn't need emergency waivers this summer. We were hoping that this issue would be permanently resolved by Congress, and we were hoping that we would have legislation by now that would allow year-round nationwide sales of E15 without the need for these emergency waivers. What these waivers do essentially is they allow existing retailers, gas stations that are already selling E15, to continue doing so. But because they're issued on an ad hoc emergency basis, they're really not attracting new participants, new retailers into the E15 marketplace. We still have, many of the major retail gas station chains saying, look, I'm not interested in selling E15 if I can only do it 8.5 months every year, or I don't know until March or April if I'm going to be able to sell it in the summer. So we're not going to make the modest investments, and we're not going to spend the administrative time and the human resources to make the switch to E15 until we know it's a fuel that we can offer 365 days a year, every year, without emergency waivers, without stopgap measures. And so that legislation remains very important. If there was ever a time for Congress to get that done, it is right now, given the situation in the fuel marketplace and near record pump prices, but also the situation in the ag economy and farmers facing the worst economic conditions that they've seen in almost 50 years. So, the dynamics have never been more appropriate for getting this legislation done, and we're hopeful that Congress does that when they get back from Easter recess.
Well, getting back to the technical details of these waivers, first of all, it is multiple waivers, and a lot of people don't understand that. I saw this because I saw it come up on a post. It's like, what is this? Why is it only 20 days? That's another question that people have. Why are we only getting waivers at 20 days at a time? People don't understand that at all.
No, they don't. When Congress gave EPA the authority to issue emergency fuel waivers, they limited the duration of those waivers to 20 days. Because in many cases, if you're talking about a refinery shutdown or a problem with a pipeline or something like that, in many of those cases, those emergencies can be rectified in a couple of weeks or within 20 days. And so that was the duration of these waivers that Congress authorized for EPA to issue. And so what EPA has done, which is perfectly appropriate in our view, is to say, hey, we're going to use the full extent of our authority. We're going to issue a 20-day waiver because that's what Congress allows us. That's the maximum allowed. And a few days before that first 20-day waiver expires, we're going to announce that we're issuing another 20-day waiver. And so they string together a series of these waivers to get through the summer months when E15 would otherwise not be allowed in conventional gasoline markets. Again, that's not new. That's what EPA has been doing the last 5 years. And there is, as you pointed out, a fair amount of confusion around why EPA is only doing a 20-day waiver. Well, that's all they're allowed to do by Congress.
All right. Well, getting into the legislation part now, this is carried on from the beginning of this year when we had this rural council that was formed, and they were supposed to get legislation to go forward. Randy Feenstra being the one who's head of that. The president mentioned that again on Friday when he announced the RVOs, which we'll get into next. But as far as the legislation for E15 is concerned, he said basically the same thing. He's leaving it up to Congress and these
Yep.
great people, these great legislators who love the farmers, and they're going to get it done. Specifically mentioning John Thune and Mike Johnson, and they're going to get this through. How confident are you at this point? I mean, how can you? I'm just going to be honest. How can you be confident at this point that this is going
Well,
to get done?
we certainly have heard commitments and promises made in the past, and Congress has not delivered on those promises. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in a situation where we need emergency waivers. But it is, we think, very helpful to have the president personally intervening and calling on Congress and calling on Speaker Johnson and Leader Thune to get this legislation done, get it delivered to his desk. President Trump is basically saying, look, we have done everything we can do using our administrative powers. You know, EPA Administrator Zeldin, Secretary Rollins at USDA, they've done all they can do to facilitate year-round E15 through emergency waivers. And now it's on Congress to make this permanent, to get it done, get it out of the way. And so I think there are many in the administration that are as frustrated as we are that Congress hasn't yet delivered on this. So we do have the House Counsel that started working on this at the end of January when E15 legislation was dropped from the minibus appropriations package. And here we are, you know, at the beginning of April without legislation. So again, as I said earlier, if there was ever a time to get this done, it is right now. Farmers are struggling. Consumers are struggling with higher prices at the pump. We all know what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz or not happening. So, you know, the stars have aligned to get E15 done. All the conditions that you know that could put as much pressure on this as possible are lined up right now. So we are very hopeful that when Congress gets back to town after Easter recess, that they make this a priority. Of course, the DHS funding issue is sucking up all the oxygen in Washington, D.C. right now. It's our hope that once Congress is on the other side of that distraction, that they can get focused on what comes next. And certainly year-round E15 should be part of that, whether it's legislation providing emergency assistance to farmers, whether it is a supplemental military funding package for what's happening in Iran. There will be, we think, several vehicles, several bites at the apple that would be appropriate and create an opening to attach this E15 legislation. So that's our hope. We haven't given up, and we're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and until we get this E15 legislation across the goal line.
The ever optimistic ethanol industry. You would not be where you are if you were not ever optimistic because you keep pushing. And speaking of that, before we leave E15, The story that came out this week about E15 record use in Iowa,
Yeah.
60% increase. That's huge. Talk about that and what they've done to increase the use of E15 in Iowa.
Yeah, and it's really very simple, Cindy. What they've done in Iowa is adopted policy that says retail stations need to make E15 available to consumers, and it's not even all the retail stations, but you need to make this product available to consumers and let them choose E15 if they decide to do so. It's not a mandate. It's not a requirement for people to buy it or you know, it's just making the fuel available. And what we've seen is when you do that, consumers respond, and they do overwhelmingly choose E15 to the point where last year in Iowa, 1 out of every 3 gallons of gasoline sold was E15. So, we think that serves as a really good example of what can happen if you give consumers the option, give them the choice, let them choose E15. They're going to choose it because it's a lower cost fuel. It's a higher octane fuel in many cases, and they know it's better for the environment. So give them the choice and get out of the way. And I was showing us what can happen when you do that. Uh, so we're really hoping that other states take notice of what's happening in Iowa and follow that lead. If we had, again, 1 out of 3 gallons of gasoline nationwide being sold as E15, boy, this industry and agriculture would look completely different than it does today.
Well, let's move on to the RVOs, which were announced on Friday at the White House by the president, essentially. What does that mean? Those were late, and now it's time to start working on the next one already because that's already
Yep.
going to be due. But tell us about what was announced and what your reaction was to it.
Well, we were very pleased to see the highest ever renewable volume obligations announced by President Trump and being implemented by EPA. And we do think that these RVOs are going to be incredibly supportive and favorable for the ethanol industry and drive further growth and expansion in the industry and in the domestic consumption of ethanol. And again, that's why E15 is so important to this conversation. So, all roads sort of lead back to E15. If we get year-round approval of E15 with these RVOs in place, we think the marketplace is going to move very quickly to expand the availability of E15. And I know, a lot of people have looked at the RVOs and said, well, you got 15 billion gallons for conventional renewable fuel. That's the same thing you've had the last several years. Why is this better or different? And it's different for a couple of very important reasons. One is we will not be relying on surplus volumes of biodiesel and renewable diesel to kind of spill over into that conventional renewable fuel bucket and help with compliance because those guys have their own very robust standards that they need to meet now. And so it does create more headspace in the 15 billion gallon pool for ethanol. And there's going to be more incentive, more pressure on the marketplace to fill that 15 billion gallon target with ethanol and not with other renewable fuels. So that's reason number one. And number two is we got reallocation of 3 years worth of small refinery exemptions, or 70% reallocation anyway. And that effectively means that a 15 billion gallon requirement becomes a 15.7 billion gallon requirement in both 26 and 27. So things are setting up very well for rapid expansion of ethanol consumption domestically if we can just get over the hump on E15. So RVOs we think were a home run. The only thing that would have made them a grand slam is if we'd gotten 100% reallocation. But on balance, I think a very good final rule for the industry. And you're right. Now it's time to go to work on set three in the next round of RFS volumes for 2028 and beyond.
When will those be due?
Those are due according to the law by October of this year,
That's what I
and
thought.
that's not a proposed rule. That's a final rule. Do we think EPA might miss that mark? I think there's a pretty good chance of it if history is any indication. But we also know that they are, they told us last week, right after announcing these RVOs, that, hey, we are going right to work on the next round with our eye on having those done by the end of this year. So uh, we hope that's the case, and we hope that they stay on that timeline because what we've seen is when the marketplace has certainty ahead of time and has the ability to plan and has space to kind of strategize on how these standards are going to be met, that's when we see the strongest expansion and growth in renewable fuel production and consumption. So it's our hope that EPA meets its deadline and we keep growing the RFS and keep growing the industry.
Well, let's talk about the refineries, because that was the portion that even API said that distorts the market by having these reallocation. And the president also mentioned the small to mid-sized refineries and that we can work with them. We worked with them before as far as getting E15 over the hump. Talk about the refineries that are holding this up and the issue with the reallocation and how it distorts the market. Talk a little bit about that whole thing and how they're, essentially threatening the
Yeah.
RFS.
Well, yeah, and we agree with API that small refinery exemptions distort the marketplace. They create an unlevel playing field. They create an opportunity for unfair windfall profits for small refineries, so-called small refineries that get these exemptions. It isn't fair, and so we are very sympathetic to what API and the larger refiners are saying here. It's our belief that EPA should not be issuing any small refinery exemptions. Refineries have had 20 plus years to plan for compliance and come into compliance with the RFS. This is not a new program. We're 2 decades in, and yet you've got a handful of refineries acting like this is all new to them and they don't know how to comply and raising myths and misinformation about the cost of compliance and what that means for fuel prices and all this other nonsense. Um, so the simplest and cleanest solution here would be to do away with small refinery exemptions altogether. Politically, that's probably not going to happen. Um, but we do think there is still room for significantly reforming the SRE program and shrinking the pool of refiners that are eligible to even apply for exemptions. Because what happens, is the volume that they should have been blending ends up being added to the requirements for the larger refiners. And again, we understand why they say that isn't fair and why they have concerns about that. But from our perspective, we're arguing that, hey, Congress said thou shalt blend this volume of renewable fuel. EPA said thou shalt blend this volume of renewable fuel. So if the small guys aren't going to blend it, somebody needs to. And so we have to have reallocation as long as EPA is going to keep issuing massive amounts of small refinery exemptions. If we get that pool shrunk down small enough where only truly small refineries, the more mom and pop operations, the independent folks that might operate in geographically isolated areas, if we shrink the pool down to where only those folks are getting exemptions from the RFS, then reallocation is much less of a concern for us. It's much less of a concern for the larger refineries, and it just becomes a non-issue. So that's where we hope to get with the whole conversation on SREs. And we know that the larger refineries are going to be doubling down on their efforts to get some reform on the SRE program, and we're going to be working with them to do that.
Now, as far as E15 is concerned, though, how do you think we can get over those refineries standing in the way of getting nationwide E15 legislation through? Is there any way to cut them out?
Well, I mean, first of all, you would hope that they would be reasonable actors in these negotiations, um, and come to the table in good faith and find a solution that works for everybody. Unfortunately, that's not the position they've taken. They've insisted on two outcomes. They've said we either want the status quo where you know virtually 40 refineries can apply and receive small refinery exemptions, or we need to lower the RVO volumes and do away with reallocation. Neither one of those options are acceptable to just about everyone else uh, in the supply chain. Large refiners, certainly not acceptable to us, not acceptable to the farm groups. I think at some point, Congress is going to have to decide who's being reasonable and who's being logical and who's acting in good faith in these negotiations. We've already given up a lot of things that we didn't want to give up in order to compromise and land in a place where we're comfortable enough that we can move ahead. The large refiners have done the same. The retailers have done the same. It's this small handful of mid-sized refineries that are just unwilling to negotiate and give anything. So we think at some point pretty soon Congress is going to have to decide whether they should just move forward with those of us that are acting in good faith and willing partners and willing to negotiate on a solution that makes sense for the greater good and the most actors in the marketplace.
Yeah, it's difficult to hear John Bozeman saying, "Well, I have one refinery in my in my state, and so that's what's holding me back from getting this done." And he said, "And I'm not alone. There's other people like that. Like one refinery in your state, and it's holding you back."
And it just goes to show the extent of the misinformation that's out there. That refinery, that company, which is not a small refining company, by the way, that Arkansas refinery is one of 4 or 5 refineries that they own that are all, mid-sized. They're at the very top end of that small refinery threshold. In fact, a few of them are over that threshold, and they throttle down their production just to get underneath. Um, and they've led people to believe that if they don't get their small refinery exemption, they're going to close their doors, they're going to lay off workers, and those local marketplaces just won't have fuel. And of course, that is complete garbage. It's demonstrably false. We've seen historically that those same refineries have not gotten exemptions in many years, and everything has been just fine. They keep making fuel, they keep employing workers. There's just so much misinformation and so many myths out there that it's been a challenge, and it's been a tall task for us to correct the record and get people to understand what's really happening out there in the marketplace today.
All right, last question is on the crop report. 3% decline expected in planting this year for corn. What impact do you think that would have if you're trying to increase consumption of ethanol?
Well, not much, I'd say, is the short answer. Obviously, we had a record crop in 2025. We've got very high levels of carry out or carry into this new crop year. There's plenty of corn out there. Even though the corn acreage number for 2026 was down a little bit from last year, it was still slightly above the marketplace's expectations, and it's still a high number. I mean, anytime you're talking about 90 plus million acres of corn, with the yields that we're seeing in recent years, we have no concern that there's going to be ample supply of corn to continue ramping up production here in the U.S. to serve both domestic and export demands.
The only concern is making sure those farmers stay in business.
Yeah, and that is a valid concern. I think you talk to any farmer today, and they'll tell you that things are pretty bleak when it comes to the outlook, and as they are trying to pencil out their cropping mix for this year and what they're going to do during we're in planting season now. With the cost of fertilizer and other inputs and everything else going on, it's not a pretty outlook for them. So what they need and what they've said repeatedly is we need new markets, we need new demand to help add value to our crops.
Right. They don't want another handout. All right, that's all the questions I have, Jeff. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think we covered it, Cindy.
All right, excellent. Well, keep at it. Ethanol producers say keep going, farmers say keep going. And so you just got to keep contacting your congressman and say, we want your round E15, right?
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, that's the one thing that we would urge farmers to do today, and workers in all 200 ethanol plants, is pick up the phone, call your member of Congress, call their office, talk to their staffers, send emails, send texts, and tell them, look, we got to get this year-round E15 legislation done. It is crucial right now to our farming communities and those of us in the ethanol industry. So we would strongly encourage folks to remain active. I know there's fatigue out there on E15, but this is not the time to back down. We got to double down and make sure that our members of Congress are hearing from us and they're getting the message loud and clear.
All right. Thank you very much, Geoff Cooper, President and CEO of the Renewable Fuels Association. If you want to find out more about ethanol, the ethanol industry, and policy issues like E15 and the Renewable Fuel Standard, go to the Renewable Fuels Association website, ethanolrfa.org. And that's it for this edition of the Ethanol Report. Thanks for listening.